Okay, well, happy Wednesday. And let's start out here with the Pledge of Allegiance. Oh, here we go. I pledge allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States
of America,
one nation,
for which it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under God, indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all.
The four-way test of the things that we think, say, or do. First,
Is it the truth?
second, is it
fair
fair
to all concerns?
concerns.
third,
Will it bid
Will
goodwill and
better
better friendships?
and fourth, will it be beneficial
to all concerned?
And fifth, is it fun? Right, so got a good crowd here, good. Well, to kick off today, does anybody have any family of Rotary news to share? Patricia's cat is missing, I see. She's usually up on her
My cat is missing.
on her lap or her desk for entertainment.
My 2-cat alarm system gets me up about 4 to
Good.
5 in the morning. So it's
Okay.
pacing faster than normal.
A couple weeks ago, Roger had me over for dinner. We had a Zoom dinner meeting, but of course I didn't get to eat. So we had a Thursday evening. It was just Roger and myself and his wife.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good.
I don't even know what we had. No.
Teriyaki chicken.
Okay. All right.
Let me fill you in on Larry Kinsey, if I might.
Yes.
He, as some of you know, he came from California back to Rochester to have his hip surgery on March 4th. And for about 3-4 weeks prior to that, he was really, really sick out in Oakland. And he had conversations back and forth with his doctors here in Rochester, and they told him to just let it take its course. They all thought it was a bad, bad cold. So he's been here and is still here since March 4th. I see him frequently. This morning, he told me that yesterday when he went in for his periodic heart transplant checkup, he's on 24 years now, I think. But anyway, they did a COVID-19 test on him, which was negative, and they did a COVID antibody test on him, which was positive. So they're thinking when he was sick in California before he came this way in early March, that he probably had COVID-19 out there.
Mm.
So where is he staying? Is he in the hospital or is he in quarantine or where is he?
No, he has a house here. He lives on East Center Street and he's at home. But he no longer needs to quarantine, even if he ever thought he did, because he's been verified as having the antibodies now, which is really an interesting situation.
He's a survivor twice then.
Yeah. Well,
Through
that's
a lot of
good.
heart issues.
Please, tell him hello. He should come to the meeting. Tell him to come to the meeting. We'll put him on the list.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sent him Doug's email in case I think he had some more appointments today, but I sent Larry Doug's email in case he wanted to jump on the Zoom call today. So I don't see him, so I think he's probably still down at Mayo.
Sure. Okay. And hello, Melissa and Alan and Denise.
Who is Broker Exchange?
I have a kind of a general question out of curiosity. Where do we stand approximately with membership today? I've kind of not kept track of the comings and the goings, but what number are we at about?
42.
Yeah.
42?
Mhm.
Okay.
Hey, this is Melissa from Broker Exchange Network. I just don't have my camera working today, so.
Hey, Melissa.
Hey.
Hi.
Oh,
Glad you're here.
Are you having a bad hair day?
Oh, I just like I have my laptop hooked up to my large monitors, and my large monitors don't have video camera. So
Okay,
yeah.
welcome. Okay, so let's get going here then. Patricia, you have a word of wisdom for us. And then you can introduce Tom.
Oh, well, the word of wisdom is I've been watching this Roosevelt Chronicles or Legacy on PBS. And one of the quotes, and I don't have it exactly right, but it was all about facing fear and how when you look at the politics and the world during that time when he was president and prior to that, the things that were experienced, and it was very encouraging when the right person is at the right place to lead and what can be accomplished. So anyway, what I got out of it is not to be fearful, but to be hopeful and just to do the best you can. So I didn't know I was going to do that, but this Roosevelt Chronicle, if you have a chance to look at it, it was really amazing what they had to survive and how they just didn't let anything get them down. They just kept on going forward. So that's what we've got to do. We just got to keep on going forward. And with that, we are delighted to have our speaker of today. Tom, I'm going to let you give a little bit more information about yourself, but how many of you go up to the Boundary Waters? Raise your hand, raise your hand. So, and it is an absolutely wonderful place to be. And so, Tom, if you will just take over and tell us all about saving the Boundary Waters and give us a little information about yourself.
Will do. Well, thank you very much for having me. First off, it's wonderful to see so many people actually currently sitting in the Boundary Waters. I can tell by virtue of your backgrounds that you have got quite a collection of vistas there, and that's wonderful to see. So thank you for having me today. As I've mentioned a couple times, it's probably the 5th Rotary Zoom presentation I've done, and I'm just amazed and pleased to see how quickly people have adapted to this. So my name again is Tom Landwehr, and I am the Executive Director of the Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness. It's a group that was started in 1996 out of Ely by a bunch of Ely area residents whose goal was to kind of protect the Boundary Waters from getting degraded. And over the years, they've evolved a little bit. In 2012, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a moment, the threat of a proposed copper nickel mine came up, and the group launched a campaign called the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters. And it's a campaign because there's a number of other groups that are joined in along with this, and because it's hopefully one of those things that you engage in for a while and then it goes away and then we go back to our normal business. So you'll often see the two names interchanged: Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness and the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters. We have about 16 employees. Our main office is in Ely. We've got 2 staff working out of there. Our other office is in Minneapolis, where most of our staff would be working from, but everybody, of course, is working from home now. As I mentioned to some of you earlier, I'm actually working from my sailboat right now, so you can see the nautical stuff behind me. And if I rock like this, it's because a big boat just went by. But all of us can work actually quite well remotely, because much of what we do outside of personal visits with people is done on computers and on the internet. So we're actually functioning quite well. Previous to this, I was the commissioner for the Department of Natural Resources for 8 years under Governor Dayton from 2011 to 2019. Prior to that, I worked as a wildlife biologist for DNR in the late 80s and early 90s. Then I took a job with Ducks Unlimited for 5 years, and then I had 7 years with the Nature Conservancy. So I've always worked in Minnesota. I've almost always worked in the southern half of Minnesota, and have always done conservation work. And so this gives me another opportunity to do that same kind of conservation, saving these really important natural places for the people of Minnesota, you know, now and in the future. So that's a little bit about me. I live in the cities. I grew up in the cities. I came from an outdoor family. Dad was a big duck hunter, big outdoorsman, and so that got me exposed to it at an early age, and I've spent a lot of time trying to get more and more people involved in the outdoors, both personally and professionally. And I think days like this, it reminds us how important it is to have those resources available to us, and especially in Minnesota, how lucky we are to have these public places that we can go to and enjoy fishing or camping or hunting or whatever it is we want to do. And certainly in the Rochester area, you know, places like Whitewater and Forestville State Park and so on. It was mentioned earlier that the trout streams are just filled with people. This is still one of those things we can get out and do. Most of us, many of us would do that regardless of the pandemic, but during a pandemic when we can't go to the theater, you can't go to the restaurant, these outdoor opportunities have become even more important. So very gratified to be part of this conservation movement. So what I would like to do today is to tell you a little bit about what we are doing at the campaign. I'm gonna call us the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters so that it's clear that I'm talking about those activities related to our ongoing work. And I'm going to go through some slides to tell you a little bit about the issue. First, a little bit about the area for those that don't know it. Then a little bit about the issue, and tell you some of the things that some of the people who are promoting this project will tell you versus some of the kind of reality of some of those points. So what I want to cover is tell you what we know about the Twin Metals project. Again, some of the myths and realities about that and how we believe that Minnesota ought to respond to this. So I'll give you a little background first on the boundary waters. And if you lived in Minnesota for any amount of time, you know something about the boundary waters. It is, of course, up in the Arrowhead region. It straddles the Canadian border. That dark green area on the map is the boundary waters. It's 1.1 million acres. It's wholly within the Superior National Forest, which surrounds that, and that's about 3 million acres in total. And all forested and lakes. It is bordered on the west by the Bois Forte Band of Ojibwe. The Nett Lake Reservation is bordered on the east by the Grand Portage Reservation. And there's a third reservation to the south, which is the Fond du Lac Reservation. Those are all parties to the 1854 treaty, which is what's shown in that red line there. So it's obviously the history goes back long before European settlement. It was important for Native Americans. It was important in the settlement of Minnesota because of the fur trade, and much of the heritage is related to the voyageurs who traveled those areas extensively by canoe. It is the most visited federally designated wilderness in the country. It is the largest wilderness east of the Everglades, north of the Rockies, and it is an economic engine for northeastern Minnesota. It generates somewhere in the vicinity of 70 to 80 million dollars a year in people dollars from people who are visiting, outfitters, guides, restaurants, hotels. A lot of people actually own second homes or retire up in that area because of the wilderness setting and the natural environment. Wonderful place to live, especially this time of year when everything is green and fish are biting. So the issue is this. There is a Chilean company called Antofagasta, which incidentally has a horrific record of environmental and human rights abuses, and which holds two leases up in the vicinity of the boundary waters. I'll get into the history of these leases a little bit, but this is a company which also has a history of corruption in its native Chile. And they have brought some of that same tendency to the U.S. Shortly after the last presidential election, they bought a mansion in Washington, D.C. Within 4 days, they rented that mansion to Ivanka and Jared Trump. And as I'll get into later, some of the federal policies towards this company changed dramatically after the last election. So we know the owner of the company. They have a local branch called Twin Metals Minnesota. It's wholly owned by this Chilean company. The mine, the proposed mine, I'll show you a map in a moment, but it's underground. It's adjacent to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in the Superior National Forest. This is a close-up of that mine location. Up where the word "what" is where the town of Ely sits. So if you can envision Ely up in that top left corner, that black line that squiggles through the middle is Highway 1, Minnesota Highway 1. And the Boundary Waters Canoe Area is the dark green on the top right. The remainder of the map, the light green and all the colored areas are all federal, for the most part, federally owned lands. Those very colorful squares on the left side of the map, those are all leases. They're mining leases that have been provided to different companies, either by the state or by the federal government. Those light blue leases on the top where it says 1353, and those reddish leases just to the lower level that say 1352, those are two federal leases. It's federal land. It was land that was leased to a company back in 1966. The company was called International Nickel and Copper, to prospect for and potentially mine in those areas. Over the years, over the last 40-some years, those leases have now been secured by Twin Metals, Antofagasta, for mining and leasing. Just so there are four, you can see the four oval shapes that are on there identified by light blue. Those are each deposits. Those are copper nickel deposits that have been identified by drilling in the rock. The Iron Range, of course, is way off to the left or to the west here. Some of the historic Iron Range is just off this picture, but the really big iron mines are 15, 20 miles away. There's been no historic mining in this area. There's no iron in this particular area. This type of geologic formation is found on the edge of the iron deposits. And these geologic formations are PGM, platinum group metal deposits. And so they have platinum, palladium, gold, nickel, copper, silver in them at very low concentrations. So the concentrations of these metals is less than 1%. So if you take 100 pounds of rock and you take the metal out of it, you'll have less than a pound of ore in that. So so to the average person, that seems like a very low concentration, but to a mining company, that is economically viable for them to mine. So these two leases, again, are both held by Antofagasta. The one that's labeled Maturi is where this current proposed mine is located. You can see just on the west side of it there is a body of water. It's called Birch Lake. Birch Lake is formed by a river that comes from the northeast, the Kawishwe River. It comes down to that V location on the north side of Birch Lake, and it turns north. There's a dam right where that M in Maturi is that backs that water up and creates Birch Lake. So this Kawishwe River comes in, hits that lake, heads north, and that water then flows back into the Boundary Waters. So you can see the project is outside the Boundary Waters. The water that goes by the project comes from the Boundary Waters, and then it returns back into the Boundary Waters. So that is one of our largest concerns, is that this close proximity to the Boundary Waters is going to have a negative effect on the water quality of the Boundary Waters, as well as some of the terrestrial environment in the Boundary Waters. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So before I leave that, any questions on that map? Okay, if not, feel free to ask questions anytime. So here's what it actually looks like. So the far horizon, that water going off on a far horizon, that's the Kawishwe River coming towards us, and then it makes a sharp bend and goes off the left side of the picture. The water on the right is Birch Lake, and that red octagon, that is the location of the proposed mine. So you can see what that landscape looks like right now. It looks like the Boundary Waters. It is all Superior National Forest. It's all forested and water, a lot of wetlands and rivers and streams in there. It's clearly not an industrial mining site like you would see in Hibbing or Eveleth. And right now it's just undisturbed forest. So we know the location of the project, and the location is clearly not amenable to sulfide or copper mine. What else do we know about the project? Again, as I mentioned, the nature of the deposit, that should be 0.3 or 0.4% mineral. It's less than 1% mineral. These minerals, when they're bound in the bedrock like they are always bound with sulfur. So the sulfur in a compound is called sulfide. When that sulfide-bearing rock is exposed to air and water, it turns into sulfate. It turns into dissolved sulfate. Sulfate is not a highly toxic chemical in and of itself, but it has really bad environmental impacts. Minnesota is one of the few states with native wild rice. When the sulfate in a water body exceeds 10 parts per million, it kills wild rice. So we have a state standard that says you can't discharge more than 10 parts per million because of the impacts of sulfate. Additionally, sulfate concentration in the water has a propensity of releasing mercury. Mercury's everywhere now because it's discharged on the land by virtue of the smoke that leaves coal burning plants. We have mercury even in the boundary waters now, but it's bound up in the bottom soils until you have a high level of sulfate, in which case it's released. Bugs eat it, minnows eat it, walleyes eat it, and so now there are health advisory warnings on fish in that area because of mercury. So if you increase that sulfate, you increase that mercury, which ultimately can have an impact on people who fish or who eat fish. We know that they're ultimately proposing 20,000 tons a day for up to 20 to 30 years extraction. And when they take the ore out, when they take that less than 1% ore out and they're left with 99 pounds of waste, a little bit of that is actually going to be put on the trains with the ore, but most of that is left over as tailings. So all of the waste, they grind this rock up into essentially the consistency of flour and separate the ore from it. The 99 pounds that is tailings, about half of that is going to go back into the underground mine. The remainder of it is going to be stacked up on the ground. So they're going to have what they call a dry stack tailings. It's going to be essentially a pile of sand that's going to be placed on the ground that will be there essentially forever. So we know that about the project. So now what the proponents are saying, and there are a lot of people that support this, you know, there's the, some of the mining communities up there support it, some of the elected officials support it, some of the communities support it. Many of them are saying, you know, Minnesota's got tough environmental laws. Let's allow this process to proceed before we draw conclusions about whether or not it should be done here. But when they say that, they're ignoring the fact that this project had already been killed in 2016. There's a lot of words here. I'm not going to read them all, but in 2016, when the Forest Service was reviewing these leases, remember, where they were issued in 1966, they were issued for a 20-year period with 3 10-year renewals possible if the company actually started production. Well, the company never did, but the government still went ahead and gave 2 10-year renewals. At the time of the 3rd renewal, which was in 2012, that's when my group got involved, the federal government was compelled to go through a process to decide whether or not mining was compatible with this environment. After 2 years of public process in 2016, the federal government said, no, it's not compatible. We're going to not renew these leases. And furthermore, we're going to undertake a study to determine whether or not any mining is acceptable in this location. So we know what happened in 2017. We have a new president. Within 3 weeks, the federal government was reviewing those previous decisions. Ultimately, the federal government has now renewed those leases, given them back to the Chilean company, and they stopped this 2-year study that was underway to determine whether mining was compatible 20 months into the process, and they've refused to turn over any of the reports that they've got about that study, even to Congress. Representative McCollum has asked them repeatedly. They've refused to release those reports, which we assume means that the reports indicate that the project is not acceptable for that location. So when people say follow the process, they ignore the fact that this project was already killed once, and there was a strong ecological argument for why that ought to be killed, and the Forest Service decision has never been overturned. The Forest Service finding that this was incompatible has never been overturned. So the process has already been sabotaged. The process should work with an initial federal review, environmental analysis. They should issue the lease. The Forest Service is supposed to agree. They put in an application, it goes through environmental review. In this case, the very first step was never undertaken. They never did that initial environmental review because it predates environmental laws. 1966, the lease was issued. 1972, 1973, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act came along. So that first step was never taken. The Forest Service again said it's not compatible. That consent has been, failure to consent has been disregarded, and it's just disingenuous to say follow the process if you ignore these very first key steps. Proponents are also saying Minnesota has strong environmental regulations. We can do this safely. We can have both mining and tourism, and that sounds great. And we, Minnesotans, we like to believe that. But here's the reality. We have a two-step process for a mine like this. We go through an environmental impact statement, or EIS, which is a process of collecting a bunch of information. And then after the EIS, we go into a permitting process. Well, the EIS looks at a lot of different things. So it looks at all of the environmental impacts. It'll look at some of the social impacts. It'll look at the health and economic impacts. It collects a lot of data, but it is just a data collection document. I use the analogy that if you're buying a house, you get an appraisal, you get an inspection, you get all kinds of information, but that isn't a decision document. At the end of the day, you still have to make a separate decision based on that data. So environmental review, very comprehensive. But once that is done, then when it comes to permitting, there are only a handful of issues that are make or break for a project. So for instance, you have to meet air quality standards, you have to meet water quality standards. If you can't meet them, the project doesn't go forward. You have to show that you have an appropriate reclamation plan. If you can't do that, the project can't go forward. So there are like 6 permits that DNR has to issue, and if the company fails on any of those permits, then the project can't go forward. But the permitting doesn't consider all of those issues that the environmental impact statement addressed. And so, for instance, the economic impact in the area, and the proponents will tell you it's going to be good for the economy. There have been several studies that have demonstrated that, in fact, if this mine comes in, it cannibalizes a lot of those existing businesses. People don't want to live by a mine. They don't want to have a resort by the mine. They aren't going to be running their business by a mine. And so those businesses leave. The mine comes in, it's busy for 20 years, generates some revenue, and then they go away, and you're left with a boom and bust cycle with less economic activity after the mine than had been there before. So these studies show that over a 20-year period, you actually have a healthier economy without the mine than you do have with the mine. But there's nothing in the permitting process that considers that. So DNR looks at that and says, yeah, well, that's useful information, but we don't have a permit that says you have to have a positive economic value. So the permitting is not comprehensive, and it fails on some major issues like economy, social welfare, property values, and so on. But even where they do have permitting, and that's the next bullet, they have to, the company has to meet certain state standards in order to get a permit. But those standards allow for degradation. State standards actually allow for pollution. They don't say you can't pollute. They just say you can pollute to a certain level. And those levels were never set with the intention of preserving an area as clean as a wilderness. So I've mentioned sulfate, for instance. So the sulfate standard will be 10 parts per million. They can't discharge more than 10 parts per million of sulfate. Well, right now, the water quality in Birch Lake is 1.5 parts per million. So this project could move forward and meet state standards and have a 600% increase in sulfates in the water, which, as I mentioned, has negative impacts on mercury take up by fish, and so subsequently will have a negative consequence on people who eat fish. It doesn't consider, state standards don't consider what happens when you cut up the forest. State standards don't consider what happens when you bring invasive species in, either aquatic or terrestrial. The role in climate adaptation is not considered. And the tailings pile is enormous. It's 430 acres. It'll be 130 feet tall. This is a kind of a gross depiction of it, but it'll be 80 feet taller than the surrounding trees. It'll be 430 acres, which is about 2/3 of a square mile, and it will be there forever. And so you have this visual blight that is never addressed in the permitting as well. And so all of these points are that the permitting requires a company that meets certain state standards. It does not mean that they won't have a negative impact on the landscape. So the notion that we've got tough standards is weak at best. That red arrow on this map shows where the project is located. And you saw some of the lease locations that are shown here as well. That brown color that snakes from the north, that is where the water flows. So that Cushby River comes from the northeast, and then it starts flowing north as soon as it hits that Birch Lake. It flows up to the Canadian border, flows along the Canadian border, into Voyageurs National Park, then up to the Rainy River, ultimately into Lake of the Woods, and then up to Hudson's Bay. So any pollution that gets in the water here goes right back into the boundary waters, goes right into those international border waters, then goes into Voyageurs National Park. If you've been to the boundary waters, you know that that water is clean enough you can literally drink it out of the lake with a cup. But once pollution gets in there, you can never get it out. This is a wilderness area. You know, not even cans or bottles are allowed. So obviously there's no roads, there's no infrastructure, there's no water treatment plant, there's no electricity, there's no way to clean pollution up when it gets in there. It is permanent. And even a small accident will have irreparable damage to that area. So when people talk about the state standards being very strong, perhaps compared to other states they are, but they were never intended to protect a wilderness, and pollution that gets in there is forever. And finally, just an observation, compliance by mining companies with state water quality standards is dismal. We've got a terrible history of what are called legacy problems, old mines closing, water pollution being around for a long time. And that gives us no confidence that even if they had strict standards, that there'd be any compliance with that.
Tom, I have a question.
Sure.
What would they use for transportation? Railroad or barge or air to get equipment in and out?
So what they are proposing, I'm going to have to go back a few maps. So what they are proposing, so this will be the mine site. So they got a, I don't know if I've got a picture of that, but the processing facility will be right here. Can you see the arrow?
Yes.
By 1350. That's where the processing plant will be. They have an underground tunnel that goes into the deposit, and then they have an underground mine. So they mine it all out. They take it back up through that tunnel to this site. They go through some processing. So as I mentioned, they grind it up into the size of flour, and then they use what's called a flotation separation system. So they use certain chemicals and float this powder in water, and the minerals settle out, and the rest of it they can separate off. So now they have what they call concentrate, and this will be, 30% concentrate. So instead of 1%, it's going to be 30% metal. They're going to drive that out on trucks, out to this Highway 1, then on Highway 1 up to Ely, then down Highway 169, down to Duluth, where they put it on ships. So that's the plan right now. All of this stuff, this 80 truckloads a day, 80 semis a day, you're going to come out onto Highway 1, up through Ely, and then on down through to Duluth. So that's their plan right now. It's going to be loaded on ships, and so that answer the question?
Yes.
So, but that gets to the next irony around this, is that the proponents are saying we need to secure these critical minerals for domestic security. You know, we're too dependent on China and foreign governments for these critical minerals. Well, so here's the reality. Well, A, there's a surplus of copper. It's globally available. It's immensely recyclable. Prices right now are an 8-year low, reflecting the fact there's no shortage. In fact, even this company says there's going to be a surplus for at least the next 2 years. But the true irony is that when they load that stuff onto that ship, they are taking it to Asia. 65% of the product that this company generates, and all their product right now comes out of Chile, 65% of it is sold to Asian markets, but all of it is essentially smelted in Asian markets. We don't have precious metal smelting operations in the United States. So they're going to be taking this stuff from Minnesota, giving it to a Chilean company. that's processing it and selling it in Asia. We will be buying these Minnesota minerals back from China after they're processed. So there's absolutely zero security, domestic security in that process. In fact, I would argue it's less because we're giving these minerals to a foreign company. Conversely, if we actually left them in the ground, there's real security. At some point in the future, if it's absolutely critical we get those minerals, let an American company come in and take them. Right now, we're giving them to a Chilean company. We're going to be buying them back from China. Proponents are saying we need the jobs. I talked about this a little bit already. You know, the range has been trying to diversify for more than 70 years. Many of you may have heard of the Iron Range Resources Rehabilitation Board, IRRB. Founded in 1941, they get a percentage of royalties that come off of some of the ore in order to look for economic development opportunities to diversify the economy of the Arrowhead. Well, right now we've got a diverse economy. There is a healthy mining operation up there on the range. There's a blip on the radar right now with COVID, but the mines have been going, you know, double shifts a day for the last several years. The Boundary Water is providing in excess of $70 million of additional economic activity that is totally sustainable. As long as you've got this wilderness area that people want to go to, and it's more popular every year, that will continue to generate additional dollars. If that amenity disappears, people leave the area, the businesses close, now you're more and more dependent on mining than you were before. You just re-engage in that very cyclical boom-bust economy. It is not at all the diversification that the area needs. Unemployment, again, notwithstanding the pandemic, was at a historic low. And again, the chair of the Harvard economics department did a study, said that you will have less economic activity over 20 years with the mine than without the mine. And finally, especially with underground mining, they're moving rapidly to automation. They don't want to put people underground because it's dangerous. They can put machines underground. They can run 24 hours a day, no injuries. And of all the sectors of mining, underground mining is moving faster to automation than anything else. Those jobs, by the time this project actually got on the ground, would likely evaporate. I mentioned that dry stack tailings basin. The company is saying it's environmentally friendly. Well, actually, the reality is that the dry stack was developed for areas where there is not a lot of water. Most of our other tailings basins in Minnesota are wet stack. This technique was never developed for a wet area like Minnesota. DNR considered this approach for polymet. They found that the practice is not suitable for wet environments, largely because there's significant risk of pollution when you've got this huge pile of dust that's got this these toxic wastes in it. When it rains and the seepage goes through, or when the dust flies off and the water picks it up, that pollution gets spread far and wide. So the DNR concluded it was not recommended for this area. As I mentioned, 130 feet tall, 430 acres in size, even if they rebury half of their tailings. So just in short, just to wrap it up, you know, the forests, lakes, and wetlands adjacent to the Boundary Waters are not industrial mining lands. They have the highest level of protection that the U.S. can provide by declaring them a federal wilderness. Based on the history and the current technology of mining, we know that there's no way that a mine can be developed without severe off-site impacts, especially with water quality and throughout the watershed. Damage in the BWCA is irreversible. You know, it's not infrequent that you hear about a tanker truck spilling into the Mississippi. They get the booms out, they get the vacuums out, they pick up 95% of that oil that spills. You can't do that in the Boundary Waters. There's just no way to recover it. We know enough now to know that the mine should not be constructed. So just very quickly, what is it that we're doing? You know, we really have to work on multiple fronts. Again, this project was killed in 2016. It's resurrected. This administration is trying to cram some of these things through as fast as it can. What we find is that when people know about this project, they know what's at risk, that they are very strongly in favor of our position. There was a poll that came out of the Star Tribune a couple months ago. It found that 60% of Minnesotans are opposed to this project, 20% were in favor of the project. It mirrors polling that we've done that shows that 70% of Minnesotans are opposed to this project. By getting the word out, you know, through any number of ways, this is one of them. meeting with you. We educate people about what the project is. We have 2 lawsuits right now in federal court. We're suing the administration for unlawfully reinstating these leases. And we're in the Court of Appeals on one case, and we just filed a second case that has yet to be heard. So we believe that ultimately the courts will find in our favor, and that's one of our key strategies. We have worked with Congress, our congressional representatives, especially Representative McCollum, but our senators as well. Representative McCollum introduced a bill this year, House Resolution 5598, that puts a moratorium on mining in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. There's got 40 sponsors on that so far, co-sponsors. We're trying to get more, and we're trying to get our senators to introduce a companion in the Senate. We're working with candidates both at the federal and state level to let them know of our concerns and try to educate them. And we're also working through the permitting process. So the company has now filed its applications. They did that in December to both the federal government and the state government. And that starts a public process to do the environmental review and then do the permitting. And so we're working, we've contracted with scientists who can talk about the chemistry, who can talk about the forest ecology, and bring their expertise to bear. And then we're doing a lot on social media. So when you go to our website, there's a petition you can sign that puts you on our email list. And so we really have an aggressive information campaign to keep people updated on what's going on. And so we do some fun stuff. And so we tried this earlier. This may or may not work for you, but if you have a camera on your phone and you point this phone at that QR code, sometimes it will take you automatically to our website. On our website, we have a virtual Boundary Waters trip. So it's what they call a 360 experience. You get a tablet or you get your phone and you can turn it any way, left, right, up, or down, and it'll pan around a Boundary Waters setting. So you get a virtual Boundary Waters experience. It's proved more challenging than we had expected, but it's kind of a fun thing we can use, like at a state fair, if there was a state fair, or with congressional representatives or so on, to give them a flavor of what the Boundary Waters is like. So feel free to take a look at that site if you want. If you don't have the QR code, at the very bottom there, savetheboundarywaters.org is our website, and there's a lot of information on there about the project, about our work, and some of the businesses we work with and so on. So I encourage you, if you would like some more information, to go to savetheboundarywaters.org. And so with that, I guess that is all I have, and I would be happy to take any questions. So I'm going to stop sharing here and go back to that screen.
Okay, I'd like to make a couple of comments. You hear me, guys?
Please.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, I've since getting introduced to the area back in 1979 through Outward Bound, I've been going up. Haven't gone up in the last few years because of family and medical issues, but I guided up there too, and into the. And you mentioned the Quetico, which is just in Canada, and the Quetico Provincial Park, which is a beautiful area too. Let me ask you a question. First of all, it's my understanding, and I'm a member of your organization, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
I don't think that this kind of mining, the sulfate mining, has ever not polluted wherever it was done. Is that true?
That is correct. In the U.S., 100% of mines have polluted, and 100% have violated standards because they have accidents, and when they are planning the project, they use modeling, and modeling is great. There's a saying among modelers that models are always wrong, but they're sometimes useful. And so if you model a certain level of pollutant, well, you might hit it sometimes, you might not hit it other times, but once it happens, you can't reel it back in.
And we're talking also, you mentioned the sulfates and stuff, but we're also talking about, excuse me, the injection of sulfuric acid into the environment too, aren't we?
Because sulfur at the right concentration, again, when it's mixed with air and water, it forms sulfuric acid. It's often called acid mine drainage or acid rock drainage. And, you know, obviously sulfuric acid is very, very potent acid. It's what's in your car battery. This water in the boundary waters is very, very sterile. It has almost no capacity to buffer either acid or other types of chemicals that are introduced. And so a little bit of acid can affect that ecosystem very, very dramatically. And so acid mine drainage is a huge concern, as well as all of the other components. So heavy metals, when you get acid, any acidic environment, so the pH neutral is 7, anything below 7 is acidic. When a pH drops below 7, all of a sudden it starts interacting with all of these other heavy metals, mercury, lead, cadmium, and it starts releasing those as well. So there's this ripple effect, there's this cascade effect. Anytime you introduce a new chemical compound into water that has these subsequent reactions that are very unpredictable and they're very unique to each situation. Don, you mentioned Voyager's Outward Bound. That facility, as you know, is right on the Kawishwe River. It's just north of this mine site.
Yeah, I know. I've paddled that area many, many times, and my former instructor, Bert Hyde, who still lives up in that area, he and I maintain a relationship for all these years.
Any other questions?
My question is, what's left to be done?
Well,
there are lawsuits and there's social media, and you're working on with legislators. What's left to be done?
Well, we think we're working on every front, but you know, lawsuits take time. It'll be 2 years before we get a result from any lawsuit. You know, congressional work is slow. We're working on that. We had hoped to do something at the state capitol this year, but when COVID hit, that kind of threw everything into disarray. The permitting process is a long, slow process, and so we're engaged on that, but that's going to take a long time. We're looking for any avenue we can to end the project or get the company so that they back off, but any of these just takes time, and we just have to keep, you know, kind of keep pedal on the metal moving forward.
It's very interesting. So thank you for your work.
Well,
I want to mention something to you, Tom. My wife was going through some old photos of the last couple of days, and her grandfather was Watkins for the Watkins Company, and he, back in the 1927, he went up to, and did a trip up in what was out of Basswood. There was no Boundary waters then, of course. And I looked at one of the pictures, and on the back it had written, Sig Olson was his guide.
Oh, I'm not kidding.
This guy was standing next to him, although unfortunately, you know, they were unloading the canoes, and Sig had his back to my to the camera, and I said, "You're kidding me? Your grandfather was guided by Sig Olson."
Wow.
And so I thought that maybe that would be kind of a funny story to tell you.
That's very, very, very cool. I actually, when I was in college, I went to the U of M. This must have been 1977. Sig Olson came and spoke at the St. Paul. I was on the St. Paul campus. He came and spoke, and I had a book of his. I think it was Listening Point. I forget which book it was, but he signed it for me. So I have an autographed copy of Sig Olson's book. And if you've not read his books, I would encourage you to take a look. His original book, I think, was Listening Point.
Yeah.
But the art in it, the illustrations in it, are all black and white woodcuts for the most part, pen and inks, by a fellow by the name of Francis Lee Jacques, who is also an extraordinarily famous nature artist from Minnesota, and did the dioramas that are now at the Bell Museum. And the artwork accompanied by the prose is just phenomenal. It's really, really some of the best writing come out of Minnesota.
Oh yeah, his books, I have all his books. It's just fantastic.
Yep. I had my 2 college kids, my son and my daughter, and my daughter's boyfriend up to the Boundary waters. We were up on Brule Lake Thursday, Friday, Saturday over the weekend, and my kids have been up there before. My daughter's boyfriend is from Chicago. Had never been up there before. He just thought he died and went to heaven. I mean, you can speak to this, but the transformative power of that place, especially for an urban kid, is just unbelievable, because they have never been in that setting where they're not surrounded by humanity and surrounded by infrastructure, and here they are totally on their own in terms of taking care of themselves, and it really just gives them a whole new perspective on life.
Yeah, I took my nephews up there one time, a couple times, and they were 13 years old. They're brothers, a couple of years apart, and at night they just look up. I mean, it was like their jaws drop. You know, nobody knows what the night sky really looks like unless you're up there.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you all very much. I very much appreciate your inviting me. I appreciate your attention. You know, do feel free to take a look at our website, and you know, if you ever would like to visit again, just let me know.
Thank you.
All right.
Next week we have Mayor Kim. So come with questions.
That's great. Okay. All right, I'll end this meeting today with a quote here. So it's not enough to be busy, so are the ants. The question is, what are we busy about? So Rotary opens opportunities, so go out and find something to do. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye now.